So it turns out that you can't drive between South America and North America, and there's a simple reason for that. There are no roads connecting the two continents, not even a rudimentary one. Technically, you could try your luck crossing on foot, but let me tell you, that would be a huge mistake. The region that connects the two continents is called the Darien Gap. It stretches across southern Panama's Darien province and the northern part of Colombia. The only land route there is a 60-mile jungle trek. Crossing it can take anywhere from 3 to 10 days. It depends on weather conditions, how much you're carrying, and honestly, just pure luck. Chance plays a big role here, because this isn't some chill, relaxing nature walk. It's a harsh, extreme environment, known for being completely isolated and one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Still, people seem to forget that and go there anyway. Every year, the number of people crossing just keeps growing. In 2014, fewer than 10,000 people crossed the gap. In 2023, that number increased to 520,000. Now, you might be wondering, what are so many people doing in the middle of the two American continents, risking all that danger? Well, that's because the Darien Gap has become a route for refugees migrating to North America. But to get there, they face all kinds of dangers, from insect bites and infections to serious fractures. We're talking about a no-man's land. Since there are no police stations, immigrants must also watch out for thieves. Along the way, they have no choice but to rely on and support each other. Most people start the crossing with at least a tent or tarp, rain boots, water, and some food. But these things get heavy fast, and people normally can't carry enough supplies for the entire journey. At some point, people start drinking river water to avoid dehydration. But the water's full of bacteria and dirt, so it causes intestinal issues. And if things get serious, there's no medical help there. To make this whole scenario even worse, the temperatures are brutal, often hitting over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, a small subset of people who venture through the Darien Gap are hardcore adventurers and travelers looking for a survival experience in the jungle. But this region is no place for a relaxing vacation. A group of tourists who went there in 2023 ended up getting jungle rot, a fungus that affects the feet. The situation got so bad that a woman had to be carried out by the group on the last day because she couldn't walk. No matter how prepared people are for the Darien Gap, in the end, survival mostly comes down to luck. Out there, travelers won't find cities with solid infrastructure where they can crash at a hotel and gear up for the next day. In some spots, they might stumble across basic camps right in the jungle. These camps might offer wooden platforms for tents, bucket showers, toilets, and even plates of chicken and rice. But it all comes at a price. Wi-Fi, for example, might cost $2 an hour, and that seems like a pretty good deal, considering there's no cell phone service on the trail. They pretty much lose all contact with the outside world. Now picture a dense rainforest with steep, muddy terrain. The hiking trail is littered with boulders and tangled with vines, like nature's own tripwires. It climbs sharply over a mountain, becoming a serious challenge even for someone in good physical shape. The area also gets constant heavy rainfall, which can lead to landslides, flash flooding, and extremely muddy conditions. The situation gets so intense that even the t-shirts and faces of those who make the crossing end up covered in mud. They'll also have to cross a lot of fast-moving rivers. A Venezuelan dad who recently went through the area with his 2 kids said their sneakers ripped apart on the very first day. That's how powerful the rivers can be. And they're deep, too. Sometimes the water reaches all the way up to their shoulders. But the dangers in that area aren't recent. For centuries, the Darien Gap was thought to be impossible to cross. The first Europeans who ventured into Latin America saw it as kind of a jungle training school. They totally knew about its dangers, but still, many adventurers tried to make the crossing in the years that followed. In 1854, for example, an expedition disappeared for 49 days in the jungle, battling starvation and exhaustion. Then again, in 1870, A group of 100 men set out to cross it. Even though they were well prepared and carried cutting-edge equipment for the time, they still suffered tremendously during the journey. They had to rely on incredible resilience to survive the challenge. Over the years, people who ventured in often ended up passing away from hunger, thirst, and even drowning in rivers. They also faced the risk of being attacked by dangerous animals like jaguars, white-lipped pecaries, and the fer-de-lance, a fast, irritable snake that is one of the most venomous out there. The area is also swarming with mosquitoes, which can spread serious health problems. Leaning against trees to rest can also be risky. This jungle is full of spiked chunga palm trees, which are covered in long black spines up to 8 inches long. Unfortunately for us, these spines are covered in all sorts of bacteria. Just brush against a chunga, and you could end up with infected wounds. And yet another danger is getting lost in the dense forest and never finding your way back to safety. These days, though, this risk is a lot lower. Some people have mentioned color-coded markers that help guide travelers and keep them from going the wrong way. If they see blue or green fabric tied to trees, it means keep walking. But if they spot red fabric, that's a sign they're going the wrong way and need to turn around quickly. Since there are so many dangers, why not just build a road through the Darien Gap? While it might seem like a good idea, building a road connecting Panama and Colombia isn't really that simple. The Darien Gap has a humid climate, tough terrain, and constant rainfall, which means any attempt to build a functional road would be highly challenging and super expensive. Even though there have been previous attempts to fill in the gap. See, there's a huge road system called the Pan-American Highway, which stretches all the way from Alaska to the southern tip of Argentina. Nowadays, this highway hits a roadblock right at the Darien Gap. But it wasn't supposed to be like this, as the original idea was for the road to go through there. Leaders from Latin American countries tried to make this plan happen in the 70s, and then again in the 90s. But a lot of people were against it, mainly because they wanted to protect the local communities and the rainforest. Since the Darien Gap is mostly untouched by humans, it's one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. It's believed that 1 in 5 species are endemic to the region, meaning they only exist in that specific area, like the Darien pocket gopher and the slatty slender mouse opossum. A road would have really damaged the ecosystem in the area, so the plans were scrapped. Eventually, an alternative was created to travel by sea. At least 2 companies started a ferry service connecting the 2 countries. However, the business wasn't profitable, and they ended up shutting down. Not long ago, Panama decided to close the Darien Gap route. Now they're sealed off with barbed wire fencing. It might just be a matter of time before other routes are created. But if you are an adventurer looking to visit South America, it's probably not best to wait for that. Traveling by plane to Colombia will always be a much safer option.
There's a stretch of water that even the most experienced explorers fear. No matter what season you choose to cross it in, you risk meeting face-to-face with waves that can reach as tall as the Hollywood sign. I'm talking about the Drake Passage, the waterway connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from Cape Horn at South America's southernmost tip to Antarctica's South Shetland Islands. It's about as wide as the distance from London to Berlin and takes up to 48 hours to cross. Some sailors compare getting on the other side to going to the moon. That's how challenging it is. Even the man who discovered it, Sir Francis Drake, never sailed these waters because they seemed too dangerous to him and opted for a calmer, although longer, Strait of Magellan. The passage took the lives of around 20,000 sailors and over 800 ships. Tourists who want to see Antarctica cross the Drake Passage on a regular basis, although it's still often called the world's most terrifying ocean crossing. The Antarctic Peninsula, where travelers go, isn't really part of Antarctica itself. It sticks out and points towards South America like 2 fingers almost touching it. The water gets squeezed between these 2 land masses, making strong ocean currents. The passage is part of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest ocean current on Earth. The water rushes through the passage at a speed between 95 and 150 million cubic meters per second, which makes it rougher. And then there are winds that usually blow from west to east and are very strong between 40 and 60 degrees latitude. That's why those areas are called the Roaring Forties, Furious 50s, and Screaming 60s. Land slows down winds, which is why storms hitting Ireland and the UK get weaker as they move east. But Drake's latitude is the only place where winds can blow all around the Earth without being stopped by land, so they keep getting faster. These strong winds turn into huge waves that can hit ships really hard, normally around 13 to 16 feet tall. They're much higher than waves in the Atlantic. Drake Passage also has underwater mountains that you can't see. The huge current squeezes through this narrow passage and causes waves to crash against these mountains underwater. These internal waves create whirls that bring cold water up from the deep ocean. So it's not just rough on the surface, the water is wild all the way down. The first sailor managed to sail around Cape Horn and through the Drake Passage in 1616. It was a Dutch navigator, Willem Schouten, in 1616. But the most famous attempt to cross it was undertaken by Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton on his ship named Endurance. He and 27 of his men set off from South Georgia, aiming to reach Vassal Bay in Antarctica. But things didn't go as planned. On January 19, 1915, their ship got stuck in the ice. And by October, it began to sink. They camped on floating ice for 2 months before sailing lifeboats to a remote, icy place called Elephant Island. Shackleton and 5 men made a risky journey to South Georgia to get help. It took them 15 days to cross Drake Passage with hurricane winds. Finally, they arrived safely and organized a rescue for the rest of their crew. Scientists found the shipwreck of Endurance only in 2022, 10,000 feet below the water. In December of 2019, 6 fearless athletes decided to cross the Drake Passage by rowing a boat for the first time in history. It took them 12 days of non-stop rowing with a 90-minute rotation of rowers. They managed to do it, and it was probably the hardest possible way to cross the passage. The athletes mentioned it was cold, wet, and dirty, and the waves hit them like walls. The weather in the Drake Passage changes a lot, but ship captains can always see it coming and change their path. They will move the departure time to have a safety margin and not to get stuck in the middle of the passage in the worst possible conditions. Sometimes, the journey will be smooth and calm, and they call it Drake Lake. Other times, people on the ship will feel rough waves, which is called Drake Shake. Some experienced captains who often cross the passage say that the Drake Lake effect happens once in every 10 crossings, and they see the Drake Shake once or twice in every 10 journeys. A schooner or a kayak will probably not survive the journey among giant waves, but modest vessels and cruise ships have sturdy hulls and advanced stabilizing mechanisms. So, the journey isn't that dangerous anymore, but still, it's quite an adventure, especially if you're seasick. If you don't feel like risking it but want to travel from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean by water the fast way, the Panama Canal is waiting for you. People first started thinking about making a water path across Panama in the 16th century. Back then, a Spanish explorer found out that only a thin piece of land separated the two oceans. But it seemed impossible to build it because of the mountains and thick jungle, so the idea had to wait a couple of centuries. Finally, in 1880, France, led by the man who built the Suez Canal in Egypt, tried to make the canal. But the people who started the construction soon found out it was much harder than it looked on a map. The land in Panama was one of the toughest and most dangerous places to dig a big waterway. Workers had to literally move huge mountains in a jungle full of snakes, where it was really hot and rainy. During the wet season, heavy rain turned rivers into wild rapids and soaked the workers. Sometimes, they didn't see the sun for 2 weeks, and their clothes stayed wet all the time. Big rocks were falling, and tiny mosquitoes that carried malaria made people very sick. And then, an earthquake happened on top of everything. They were losing thousands of people. That's why France decided to abandon the project after 7 years. Then, the United States bought the French assets in the canal zone and finished it by 1914. It cost the US around $375 million. The 50-mile-long passage of water saves ships traveling between New York and San Francisco 7,872 miles. Around 14,000 ships use it every year and pay around $1.8 million in tolls. So it looks like it all paid off. Another challenging waterway in this part of the world is the Amazon River. It's around 4,300 miles long and flows through 3 countries with over 30 million people living in its basin. But there isn't a single bridge across it. The river has many marshes and soft soils, so engineers would need to build very long bridges and very deep foundations, which costs a lot of money. Building bridges over deep water is tough, but in other places in the world, engineers can use things like floating platforms to help. The river's path and water levels change a lot during the year. During the dry season from June to November, the river is usually 2 to 6 miles wide. But in the wet season from December to April, the river can become as wide as 30 miles. And the water level can rise by 50 feet. That's why they can't build floating bridges or pontoons. The riverbanks are made of soft dirt that moves and erodes with the seasons, and it makes things even harder. It would have to be an absolutely unique project to overcome all these challenges. Luckily, there's no pressing need for a bridge across the Amazon right now. The river mostly goes through areas that are sparsely populated, so there aren't so many major roads to be connected by bridges.
Around 2,500 years ago, an earthquake completely changed the course of one of the largest and most famous rivers on the planet, the Ganges. Now, it's normal for rivers not to sit in one place, so if you live next to one, it could also just disappear without a trace or flood the whole city one day. In the case of the Ganges River, a supermassive earthquake became the reason for this dramatic change. Scientists say it might happen again, and it would be a huge problem for millions of people who depend on this river. The Ganges River starts as small streams in the Himalayas and travels a long way, over 1,500 miles. Along its journey, it meets other big rivers before all the water flows into the Bay of Bengal. The Ganges has the largest delta in the world among all rivers. Just like many other rivers in the region, it slowly changes its path over time. These changes, if they happen when a river wears away its banks, usually takes a long time, sometimes decades. Scientists have discovered that the Ganges-Brahmaputra river system has shifted several times over the last 6,000 years. When they looked at satellite images of the Ganges Delta, they noticed something interesting. There was a crescent-shaped dip in the ground about 28 miles away from where the river is flowing now. This depression was over 1 mile wide and stretched for many miles. They thought it might have been an old main channel of the Ganges River a long time ago. In 2018, the team decided to visit the area to check it out for themselves and take samples to learn more about it. While driving back home, they noticed a pit where someone was digging dirt to create a pond. The next day, they planned to fill it with water, but the researchers spotted something strange in the dirt. There were vertical bands of light-colored sand mixed into the darker mud. These special layers are clues from the past. They show that an ancient earthquake made sand and water shoot up from below the ground and created sand volcanoes that were trapped in time. The scientists studied the sand and mud and figured out that these earthquakes happened around 2,500 years ago and were strong, with magnitudes of 7 to 8. The epicenter was over 110 miles away from the main stem of the river, but it was powerful enough to displace it. It could have affected around 140 million people. The Ganges-Brahmaputra system is close to spots where Earth's tectonic plates meet, so earthquakes happen here often. There's no danger right now, but scientists think that another massive earthquake could happen in the next few hundred or thousand years. It could threaten up to 170 million people. That's about half the population of the U.S. No one can predict exactly when an earthquake will happen or how strong it will be. Learning how earthquakes in the past moved rivers helps scientists figure out patterns and make guesses about similar events in the future. This knowledge could help us prepare better and create safety plans before another big earthquake strikes. Now, the Ganges isn't the only river at risk. The Yellow River, the Irrawaddy River, and rivers in the United States, like the Klamath and San Joaquin, all face similar dangers. The mighty Mississippi River has also switched its path many times over the last 7,000 years. Right now, there's a huge system of dams and barriers called a control structure in central Louisiana. This structure's job is to stop the Mississippi from spilling over its banks and joining a nearby river. But scientists think that, in theory, these barriers wouldn't handle megafloods. So, the Mississippi could break free and change its course again. This would cause massive problems, especially in southern Louisiana. One of the recent examples when a river changing its course caused disaster was the Kosi River in India. In August 2008, over just a few days, the river's path shifted by almost 60 miles, which is a huge change. Floods happen in some parts of the state rather often, but they hadn't seen such strong ones in over 50 years. They affected around 1,000 villages and 3 million people, and about 1 million people had to be evacuated to safety. Since many of these people hadn't faced floods in so long, they weren't ready to handle it quickly. It caused even more damage to their homes and lives. Scientists have been trying for decades to figure out what exactly makes rivers suddenly change their course. A new study explains that two things work together to make a river to do it. This process is called avulsion. First, there's the setup, which is like building up tension before something big happens. Over time, sediment, sand, dirt, and other stuff carried by the river gets deposited in certain places. It either raises the river above the land around it or makes a nearby slope steeper than the river's current path. Then there's the trigger, which is like the final straw that makes everything happen. This trigger could be a big flood, an earthquake, or even something like a pile of logs blocking the water. Now, researchers looked at satellite images of about 170 cases of avulsion from the past 50 years. They noticed these events happen most often near river mouths and near mountains. Rivers were about 3 times more likely to change course in these places than in the areas between them. They also studied 58 river channels in detail, using super clear maps to measure super elevation. That's how high the river is compared to the land around it. They also measured slope advantage. That's how steep a new path might be compared to the river's current one. They found that near mountains, rivers often pile up so much sediment that they become super elevated and spill over. But near river mouths, like in deltas, rivers need a steep slope advantage to break through the mud and form a new path. These two factors work together like a seesaw. If one is stronger, the other doesn't need to be as strong for an avulsion to happen. To figure out where a river might go if it changes course, the researchers created a smart computer algorithm. This tool uses maps to measure the terrain's steepness and the river's flow to predict where the river might move. They tested it on 10 past avulsions, and it correctly guessed the path every single time. Scientists hope they could use these findings to protect people living near rivers from sudden floods. Rivers changing course played a big role in creating one of the first organized administration systems in the world. Scientists found clues for this in the territory of ancient Mesopotamia. This name means the land between two rivers, and it was between the rivers Tigris and the Euphrates. People living there relied on these rivers for water, food, and transportation. Scientists wanted to figure out how these sudden changes in these rivers affected ancient people. To do this, they used two kinds of maps. The archaeological maps show how ancient cities grew over time, including what types of buildings people built. Certain buildings, like big palaces or city walls, could show when each city first had an organized administration. The second kind of map showed where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed long ago. They often shifted, sometimes slowly, and sometimes very quickly and dramatically. Around the year 5000 BCE, Mesopotamia started to become drier and farming became harder. Farmers had to grow their crops near rivers, where they could use the natural floods to water their fields or dig little channels to bring river water to their plants. Because farming was so important, towns and cities grew near the rivers too, so people could stay close to their food. But when a river suddenly changed its course, people didn't give up. They worked together to dig long canals to bring water from the new river path back to their fields. The canals helped them get water again, and the administration buildings showed they were organizing as a community to solve big problems together. Imagine you're driving across a bridge to visit a friend. The next day, you get in your car to go back, but there is no longer a river under the bridge you drove across yesterday. Believe it or not, this is exactly what happened to people in the south of Honduras when Category 5 Hurricane Mitch hit in October 1998. Choluteca Bridge, which the local authorities reconstructed earlier that year, was left in the dry, as the river now flowed around it, not under it. The structure soon became famous online as the Bridge to Nowhere. This waterway shifted its course overnight, but it normally happens over longer spans of time. A river will stop flowing straight when there is even the tiniest change in the landscape around it. Even something as tiny as a mouse can weaken a riverbank. Imagine a family of mice decides to start a home somewhere by the river and digs a cozy hole. Over time, water gets inside this hole and starts washing away any loose soil. Give it a couple of centuries, and the river will now have a bend in this place. And if you're worried about the mice family, don't be, because they moved out a long time before the water flooded their home. Things happen even faster for small streams because, well, their beds are also smaller. The current breaks down stones, the ground takes them in, and voila, a riverbed or bottom is formed. The current is the strongest in the middle of the waterway, and its power directly shapes the riverbed. The water flowing through rivers is full of soil and other particles. All this stuff goes from the spring into the mouth of a river and into Earth's oceans. In some cases, these particles build up at some point. And that's how new beaches, probably including your favorite, are born from fine-grained sand. On the other side of the river, the flow of water is much faster, so this fast-moving current literally slams against the next bank. Then, the process of erosion starts all over again. River erosion is what happens when the flowing water takes away soil. And I have to tell you, things go super fast there. That water is so energetic, it can even carve into rocks, creating a canyon. If the riverbanks consist of loose material, such as humus, that's the soil you plant a flower in, then it is easier for the flowing water to erode it. Rivers in the plains are often wide and slow because there's little resistance from the ground around them. So you don't have to worry about waves tipping over your boat on a flatland river. In the mountains, streams quickly wash away all the surface soil and gravel, revealing the bedrock beneath them. It's tightly bound, so mountain streams are literally set in stone, as they cannot wash away this bedrock. So we have erosion to blame for waterways changing their course, and also mountains and hills. When a stream reaches a mountain or simply a rock, it has two choices: to flow around it or carve its way through it. In flatlands, rivers don't have any natural competition, so they choose a more winding path. All this twisting and turning increases the river's total length from the source to the mouth. One such example is the mighty Mississippi River in the U.S. It has a lot of curves and bends, which are called meanders. In the last century and a half alone, the Mississippi changed its course several times. The last major case was in 1876 when it left the historic city of Vicksburg in the dry. 2 years later, a team of American engineers came to the area to construct the Yazoo Diversion Canal, which took 25 years to complete. Thanks to it, ships could once again sail to Vicksburg, reviving the town's economy. What happened in this southern U.S. town in the 19th century is an ordinary natural consequence of river erosion. The bends in a waterway grow sharper over time, making the water flow faster. This speeds up erosion, and individual bends slowly start approaching each other to the point they merge. When this happens, the river straightens up overnight, leaving a lake in the form of a horseshoe in the place where the bend was. This newly formed body of water is called an oxbow lake. These still water lakes either dry up, since they're no longer fed by a spring, or they turn into swamps. In some cases, humans use them as water meadows used for agriculture. Lake Shakot in Arkansas is the largest oxbow lake in North America, formed by the Mississippi several centuries ago. The source of the Mississippi is a lake in Minnesota, but a river can also start when two other watercourses become one, or when the water simply bubbles up from under the ground. Even melting snow can feed a river, like the Amazon gets its water from the Andes. Determining the source of a waterway can be tricky, so the debate about whether Amazon or the Nile is longer is still ongoing. What scientists know for certain is that the Amazon carries more water than any other river. 1/5 of all the fresh water that enters Earth's oceans comes from this South American river. When you look at the Amazon River on a map, you'll notice how it flows from Peru to Brazil, that is, from the west to the east. This direction might seem odd when you compare it to the Mississippi, which flows to the south on the map. It's so confusing because you probably know rivers flow down, affected by gravity, but down doesn't automatically mean south. Running water will try to find the easiest route down, so there are no rules in terms of cardinal directions. The Nile River is the best example of this, as it actually flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. Northern Egypt, where all those pyramids are located, is on lower ground than Sudan, where the Nile is formed when the Blue Nile and the White Nile merge. Ab in northern Asia and the Mackenzie River in Canada both flow northwest, while the Yellow River in East Asia flows in the same direction as Amazon, to the east into the Pacific Ocean. These major rivers are some of the best examples that a stream doesn't have to flow from the north to the south. Gravity is the only important factor that determines which way a stream will flow, as running water is all the time pulled downwards. The flow of water is faster on steeper slopes. When there's a sudden drop in the flow, waterfalls form. Angel Falls in Venezuela is the highest waterfall on the planet, with water dropping from a height of 2,600 feet. Watch your step. In a waterfall, the falling water can easily reach the speed of a Thompson's gazelle, but as a river approaches the end of its journey, it slows down significantly. The stream doesn't have enough energy to cut into the nearby land. All the sediment it has picked up along the way, such as sandstone, slows it down. At the place where a river meets the ocean or a lake, it gets rid of this sediment along its banks, creating a delta, an area rich in fertile soil. The Ganges in India has the biggest delta in the world, several hundred miles wide and visible from space. The Amazon, on the other side, doesn't have a true delta because the strong currents of the Atlantic Ocean wash away everything the torrent brings. The deepest section of the riverbed that runs along its middle is called a channel. This is where the current is the strongest, so ships travel on top of these channels. When engineers want to expand a waterway, they simply dig a deeper channel and voila, larger ships can now pass. This is just one way humans alter watercourses. We often strengthen the banks of a river to prevent erosion or build dams that stop or divert the flow of water. The oldest operational dam on the planet dates back to the time of Egyptian pharaohs. It was, of course, the first damn thing. Floods, tornadoes, tsunamis, hurricanes, yikes. All these natural disasters can get extremely dangerous, but we're kind of familiar with them. But how about a natural disaster that has never happened before, but could occur any moment now? It might be a super eruption. That's what happens when a supervolcano erupts. You might know that Yellowstone Park is located on top of a supervolcano. The last massive eruption there happened about 664,000 years ago, and the one before that, approximately 1.3 million years ago. If we do the math, we'll understand that the next eruption might be due anytime soon. There's no strong evidence that the supervolcano is waking up or preparing for an eruption, but what would it be like if it did happen? Months before the eruption, small-scale earthquakes would become more frequent and more powerful in the area. Not long before the eruption, the growing pressure would push up the ground over the volcano, creating a dome. Narrow cracks would open along the edges of this dome. The magma would then start rising toward the surface, and then the eruption would kick off. A massive column of lava and ash would shoot up into the air to a height of over 16 miles. The volcano would keep pumping ash for days on end. The air in that area would heat up to 570 degrees Fahrenheit. For all living creatures, ash fallout would be one of the most dangerous consequences of the eruption. Buildings and trees would start collapsing under the weight of this dense substance. It would only take a couple of days for a 10-foot layer of ash to cover the territory of about 50 miles around the center of the eruption. After the ash got into the stratosphere, the temperatures all over the world would start to drop. The eruption would also be rich in sulfur, and this element is an effective sun blocker. That's why it would soon get so cold that there would be no summer in the whole world for the next several years. The monsoon seasons would change. It would be hard for animals to find food and clean water. Well now, how about a gamma ray burst? You don't stumble across this kind of radiation in your everyday life. A gamma ray burst occurs when two neutron stars collide. The collapse of a massive star can produce it too. Gamma rays could present a serious danger to Earth. If a gamma ray burst happened close to our home planet, it could rip our ozone layer away. After that, we would be left unprotected from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Plus, gamma rays could also produce ground ozone. This kind of ozone could seep into the ocean since it's water-soluble, and that would lead to a mass extinction of marine life. Plants wouldn't survive this disaster either. Now, come to think of it, giant sinkholes could swallow entire communities. One of such sinkholes opened up in the city of New York. It pulled a parked van into the earth. That happened in the summer of 2022. And it wasn't the only sinkhole to appear in that area. Local inhabitants reported about 4,000 sinkholes all over the city. This kind of problem is also very common in Florida, and it's much more serious than it may sound. Sinkholes open all of a sudden, pulling down everything and everyone that happens to be nearby. Sinkholes appear all over the world, which makes them a global problem. They're totally unpredictable and form without warning. Luckily, experts know what causes them. In some areas, there are vast areas of groundwater. But during droughts, this water dries up. This creates large empty caverns, and after heavy rains, the surface over such a cavern can collapse, creating a sinkhole within minutes. Now, what if we came across a wandering black hole? You might know that a black hole is a region in space where gravity is so powerful that not even light can escape its clutches. Luckily, the nearest one to us is 1,500 light-years away. Nothing to worry about, right? Until you find out about wandering black holes. Now, things get definitely way creepier. If such a black hole entered the solar system, Earth would be doomed. We wouldn't stand a chance against this space monster. In 2012, 13 wandering black holes were spotted not so far away from our planet. But worry not. Not far away, in space terms, means around 1 billion light-years away. So we've got some time left. Plus, the possibility of such a disaster is very, very low. Another natural disaster we haven't experienced yet is a mega flood. It's never happened before, but the changes in climate do make for a risky potential. It could start, let's say, in California. This state experienced some really bad flooding in the past. One of such floods stretched up to 60 miles across and 300 miles long. If a similar disaster happened these days, it would cause $1 trillion worth of damage. It would also uproot millions of people. Now let's talk about a hypercane. Judging from the name, this natural disaster might get extreme. A hypercane is a theoretical hurricane of unsurpassed power. It would occur if the ocean became overheated as a result of climate change, or because of a massive volcanic eruption. In any case, these conditions could create a hurricane that would stretch way beyond the lower stratosphere. And as you may guess, regular hurricanes don't do that. The hypercane speed would reach 500 miles per hour. The pressure inside would be low enough not to let the hypercane to wear out as quickly as other hurricanes. The hypercane could last for weeks on end. But the worst thing? It could damage or even destroy part of Earth's ozone layer, and the hole could be the size of the entire North American continent. Now, this disaster did happen before. About 66 million years ago. I bet you know what I'm hinting at. Yep, that very meteor that supposedly wiped out dinosaurs off the face of the Earth. This 7-mile-wide space visitor was traveling at 67,000 miles per hour. As a result of the collision, 75% of all life on the planet disappeared, and winter reigned on Earth for 18 months. Want to know a secret? Meteors strike Earth all the time. Even more of them barely miss our planet. But it's also very hard to predict meteor strikes. Scientists miss a lot of them until they just nearly miss us. That's why experts are working on an early warning system that could prevent disasters. It could make meteor impacts less catastrophic, or at least allow people time to evacuate. It could also be our very own sun that would be responsible for another natural disaster. I'm talking about a massive solar flare. On the scale of damage to society, few catastrophes can compare to this event. It wouldn't destroy buildings like a tsunami or an earthquake. Neither would it end lives in the same way a supervolcano or meteor would. But it would cripple our entire way of life by destroying the whole electronic infrastructure of Earth. The cost of this disaster would reach trillions of dollars. It'd cause other infrastructures to fail. Communication, medicine, transportation, banking systems. Those would tumble like dominoes, and it would be incredibly hard to recover them. Earth would be left without electricity for years. There would be no electric light, no computers, no phones. Water supply systems would be out of order. There would be no food in supermarkets. There would be no electricity, and people wouldn't be able to reboot the already broken power grids. In 1859, people all over the world woke up in the middle of the night. It was as light as during the day. The skies were illuminated with auroras, red, green, purple. They appeared even in the regions where no one had seen them before, like the Bahamas, Jamaica, or Hawaii. Telegraphs got electrically charged, even though they were disconnected. In many areas, fires started. That was when technology barely existed. But imagine the avalanche of problems a solar flare could cause today.
On September 16th of 2023, without warning, the Earth began to hum. A low, strange vibration reverberated through the crust. This set off seismic alarms all across the globe. For 9 days straight, the planet was pulsing with this horrifying rhythm, and scientists had no idea what was going on. Meanwhile, the total disaster was happening in Greenland. It wasn't an earthquake. They knew that much. They could tell it by the rhythm. Since we all live on giant tectonic plates, they constantly move and slide on magma like icebergs on water. Sometimes, as they move, they can rub against each other or collide or break. In any case, all this causes an incredible release of energy that sends shock waves through the ground. That's when we feel the ground literally shaking, and it's what we call an earthquake. These vibrations we feel are called seismic waves. Seismometers pick them up as pings or rumbles. In a typical earthquake, they create a bunch of different frequencies. It's a crazy chaotic mix of low and high frequencies, like smashing every piano key. What was weird about the Greenland event is that the signals weren't like that at all. It was a steady, single-frequency vibration, as if some ancient machine was stirring beneath the earth. It's like one piano key being struck over and over, creating a doom-like, repetitive sound. Turns out, what they were hearing wasn't the noise of tectonic plates going wild. It was a phenomenon seismologists had never seen before. The days passed, and the mysterious noise just kept going. The vibrations repeated every 90 seconds, echoing around the world. The hunt for answers was growing more desperate. Seismologists had no idea what they were dealing with. They had to gather a huge international team of 68 people from 15 countries. All these scientists were gathering seismic data, satellite images, and doing some advanced math for several days, until they finally realized who the culprit was. Water. It all happened in a remote, desolate region of East Greenland. This place is full of fjords, narrow inlets of the sea between high cliffs, kinda like deep water-filled valleys surrounded by towering rocky sides. In this area, surrounded by jagged peaks and icy waters, the air was still. The landscape seemingly frozen in time. Nothing here changed much for years. Until one day, a colossal landslide has unfolded in the Dixon Fjord. One of those steep mountainsides towering over the fjord at almost 4,000 feet high collapsed in a massive landslide. Picture a huge chunk of this mountain crumbling and crashing down into the fjord below. This sent a deluge of rock and ice crashing into the water. The impact was just apocalyptic, 882 million cubic feet of debris. That's enough ice and rock to fill 10,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or 10 Great Pyramids of Giza. And all this nightmare hurled into the water with such force that it kick-started a tsunami about 360 feet high, taller than the Statue of Liberty, into the air. What's crazy is that this incredibly powerful wave was trapped in the fjord by narrow cliffs, unable to escape. It's like water sloshing in a closed bathtub. For 9 days, the mega tsunami continued to churn through it. That's why we heard this endless hum. It was a rhythmic back and forth of the water slamming against the walls. The shock waves were rippling deep into Earth's crust, vibrations so strong that they were picked up by seismometers around the globe. This was a phenomenon so rare, so unprecedented, that it left scientists stunned. It turned out to be a perfect storm of elements. A glacier, weakened by years of warming, could no longer bear the weight of the mountain above. This collapse was inevitable, and the chaos literally shook the Earth to its core. And people often hang out in this area with cruise ships passing by. We're lucky that no lives were lost in the disaster. It was a close call though. A tourist ship stranded in the area just 2 days before narrowly escaped the tsunami's reach by pure luck. But it doesn't mean there were no losses. The waves destroyed a nearby Inuit site, which was there untouched for over 200 years. They also swept away the huts at a research station that were about 43 miles away. The vibrations traveled from Greenland to the South Pole in less than an hour. That just shows how dangerous events like this can be. And this isn't the only place where such catastrophes are happening. In the beautiful California community of Rancho Palos Verdes, the ground is shifting so quickly that it's tearing homes apart. The land there has always been kinda unstable. It has some unique geology. It's built on soft, clay-rich soil and sits on a geological fault line, which makes it prone to landslides. This means that this land is prone to slow, natural shifting over many years, even when no crazy weather is happening. It's been like this for decades, but usually it's slow and pretty manageable, like about a foot a year. Imagine a tree that you played with as a kid moving 20 feet to the left as you grow up. For decades, residents adapted. They built their homes on adjustable beams. This helped the houses to move with the land, and that strategy worked well until now. Recently, things have been getting much worse in the community. Now, the land is moving by a foot in a single week. That would be like if the same tree moved almost 960 feet since you were a child. The past 2 years have also caused some heavy rains, and the weather has been getting worse. This increased water content in the soil. The land became heavier and more prone to rapid movement. Now, this once idyllic seaside escape turned into a disaster zone. Cracks have appeared in closets, gardens, and roads, growing larger with each passing day. Streets that were once smooth are now buckled and twisted, with roads turning into a crazy theme park. Houses that once stood firm are being ripped from their foundations, some of them split in half. One of the houses had its front door 8 feet off the ground. Entire neighborhoods have been plunged into chaos. Utility companies had to switch off gas and electricity indefinitely to prevent potential disasters. The hardest hit is the coastal neighborhood of Portuguese Bend, where residents are living on the edge. Literally. It always had amazing ocean views and cool sea breezes, with horses and peacocks still wandering the tree-lined streets. But now, it's like an earthquake hit. Only this time, the earth isn't stopping. For many, this place feels like paradise, if only the land would stop shifting beneath their feet. So the locals don't give up. Some of them had to leave, but many are determined to stay and fight, despite the destruction. But they still have to pour in hundreds of thousands of dollars to save their properties. People have installed generators to keep the lights on and set up sewer systems and pumps to drain the groundwater causing the landslides. Some say that the only way for these neighborhoods to survive might be to go completely off-grid, installing power walls to store energy and stuff like that. People are trying their best to run the sewer system off generators. They hope that they could get rid of this water in the soil that's causing these hellish landslides in the first place. They're determined to fight, but they will need help and support from the government to fight this disaster. Landslides are actually more common across the US than many might think. And new maps and data show that tons of people in the country might be in danger. Scientists managed to create the first very detailed, very cool map that shows where these landslides might happen, county by county. It's based on a lot of data and the history of 1 million previous landslides. They say that nearly 40% of the United States is at risk of experiencing landslide activity, which could lead to some insane catastrophes in certain areas. Luckily, now both residents and engineers can keep this in mind. But all this shows how vulnerable we are to natural disasters, and how we should always stay alerted.
If you live in a hot spot for earthquakes, like I do, you may have had these familiar shaking feelings. The ground trembling underneath you, pictures rattling on the walls, your neighbor's dog yapping across the yard. An earthquake is basically tectonic plates moving and grinding against each other. Rub your hands together really fast right now. Things heating up? That's energy. When these plates' energy get released, you and your neighbor's dog feel it on land. Yes, we're all surfing on giant pieces of land floating on hot liquid rock. You're surfing right now while watching this video. Sometimes one slides under another, like reaching in between the couch cushions for that remote that slipped down there. If you're wearing long sleeves, they get rolled up on your arm like a snake shedding its skin. When plate tectonics do this, mountains form. But let's zoom out from your bedroom. Even further. Keep going. There. Earth, the third planet from the Sun, covered in mountains, canyons, and those familiar continents with oceans stretching between and all around them. But our planet used to have just one single supercontinent, Pangaea, where all the land masses were hugging each other and enjoying the sweet life surrounded by one massive superocean. Africa and Australia were neighbors. The Americas and Asia popped up for a howdy neighbor. But fast forward about 300 million years, and here we are. And there you are, hanging 10 on molten rock as the ground beneath you forms mountains, ridges, volcanoes, and earthquakes. Sounds hardcore, but you don't feel like you're moving, do you? You also don't feel like your body is going highway speeds when you ride in a car. That's physics, and it's a funny thing. Right now, the plate under you is only moving a couple of inches a year, up to 4 when things get super speedy. Per day, that comes to half the width of a strand of hair. So let's speed things up a bit, say 300 feet a day. And me too.
You're sitting in your room enjoying a delicious cup of hot cocoa, scrolling the feed and watching some videos. As you set the mug on the nightstand, you begin to feel dizzy, like the room is spinning. You check your drink and see the liquid inside is swaying like crazy. Uh-oh, now you're swaying. You manage to get up but can't keep your balance. Everything topples over like a tornado in the room. You duck underneath your bed and cover your head. There's a power outage, and now you can't see anything.
There are two things to keep in mind when it comes to earthquakes: magnitude and intensity. Magnitude is the size of the quake. It's just one constant number. Intensity is how much shaking it causes. That number can be different depending on where you're measuring from. The most powerful earthquake ever was in Chile in 1960. Its magnitude measured 9.5 on the Richter scale. Above 7 is considered severe. The quake caused tsunamis all the way to Japan, Hawaii, the Philippines, and even New Zealand. The damage cost millions of dollars in repairs.
In the dark, you can still feel the ground shaking below you. And since the crust cut across 300 feet today, the ground rips open. The landscape where you used to bike around is now sprouting deep earth rocks and minerals. The buildings all around begin to collapse. But luckily, you manage to sneak off and escape into an open space. There isn't any service on your phone either. The cell towers toppled over during the quake, but the ground is still shaking. And with the plates moving so fast, the Earth's interior begins to show its true colors. And that color is red. Red for red hot. You can see the mantle at this point. The Earth, like an onion, is revealing its layers. With magma flowing right in front of you, you'd think you're in a disaster movie. Suddenly, you get a whiff of salty sea air, and now you're standing on the beach. But wait a minute, you don't live by the coast. If an earthquake's strength is measured by magnitude and intensity, this one's a doozy. It probably originated out in the ocean and stretched all the way inland where you are. It caused a tidal wave so big, the coast just came to your landlocked town. Waves of ocean water are gathering near the edges of the city. Farms and rivers are all gone with a single tidal wave. The land that was good for agriculture is no more. And as the ground below you keeps on cutting, it lets in some ocean water between the gaps. It collides with the magma that's rising. Steam shoots up from the ground, and the Earth looks like a giant tea kettle. With the power out and no cell signals, there's no way of communicating with anyone. And that's just the thing with earthquakes. They can show up with hardly any warning.
Unlike earthquakes, tornadoes, and typhoons, with those, we can predict their path and intensity. We can prepare. Even volcanic eruptions give people enough time to evacuate and reach safe ground. But earthquakes are just in a league of their own.
And with all the buildings collapsing around you, you'd be seeing a smokescreen of dust and debris. The air would be unbreathable. Better grab a gas mask. Off in the distance are the mountains you've always enjoyed. You trekked along the trails every other weekend and had some fantastic camping trips along the river. But the earthquake drags across the center of the mountain and creates enough pressure to cut it. Trees start falling over. The mountain becomes a pile of rock and dust. It's not over yet. The shaking ground makes large pieces of land and rock slide down and head towards the town. Some landslides are so massive, they're enough to wipe out entire villages in remote areas. Many come after heavy rain, others come completely unexpected. With the ground opening beneath you, many of the objects on land get swallowed into the pit. Cars, trees, buildings, statues, you name it. You're able to find safe ground, but you can't really know if it's all that safe. All this is happening in your town and places across the globe. But it's about to get even more global.
Plate tectonics are crucial for life on Earth. One of their main duties in a thankless job was maintaining the planet's comfortable, livable temperature. Without landmasses floating around on a layer of liquid rock, there'd be no life on the liveliest planet we know so far. A couple of billion years ago, Earth was just a little ice ball. This was because the sun, much younger back then, was colder than it is today. You'd think the oceans would be frozen and good enough to skate from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but they weren't. And it's all because scientists believe the shifting plates underneath kept the oceans warm and cozy. They did that by creating underwater volcanoes. Besides lava and many gases, they spewed carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which trapped the heat on Earth. As the sun gradually got hotter, rainfall was able to drag the carbon dioxide back to the ground and into the mantle. And this cycle was able to help the Earth maintain its temperature to host us. Gee, how thoughtful. Earth is so unique because of these plate tectonics. No other planet in the solar system can brag of the same, except for Jupiter's frozen moon Europa. It's shown evidence of moving plate tectonics within the core. And even though Venus and Mars have hot interiors, there hasn't been any sign of such activity.
As the ground continues to cut across the land, everything in sight has now descended underground. If the plates were to move 300 feet a day for a year, the entire planet's landscape would go through a total makeover. A bad one. Life as we know would cease to exist, except for maybe microscopic bacteria and a few insects that can survive such harsh conditions. The polar ice caps wouldn't hold any more ice, and volcanoes would continuously be erupting. The planet would just end up looking like a hot fireball of destruction, and maybe even burn up entirely.
Luckily, this is purely a hypothetical thought experiment. So, sit back, relax, and don't worry about the ground moving under your feet. It's taking its sweet time at a safe pace.
Woohoo!
India could split horizontally into two parts as it runs into Eurasia. The movement of the Indian plate that includes most of modern South Asia is causing the Himalayas to grow. This process started around 60 million years ago when the plate first bumped into Eurasia. Scientists from the Netherlands have used the power of an AI simulator to see what this region will look like one day. The computer model showed that the Indian subcontinent will merge with the Horn of Africa in approximately 200 million years. The present-day cities of Mumbai and Mogadishu will become next-door neighbors. They will sit along the newly formed mountain chain scientists provisionally named the Somalaya. On the other side of this geological formation, Madagascar will connect with Sumatra, while Calcutta and the island of Mauritius will occupy the same region. Sri Lanka would cease to exist as it becomes part of the Indian mainland. Further to the north, scientists predict that the Himalayas are going to increase in height in the foreseeable future. As the Indian plate continues to mile northward, there will be major changes to the surrounding landscape. The present fault line will drift further south. Tens of thousands of years in the future, there might be no Nepal. The Himalayan range will have expanded sideways to fully engulf the mountainous country. And there may be way more earthquakes in this part of the world because of this movement. Most researchers agree the speed at which India is moving northward into Eurasia is barely a tenth of an inch every year. Some of them think this is happening because of the plate's buoyancy. It prevents the Indian plate from sinking into the mantle, which gives Tibet its elevated topography. Other scholars believe that the structure is buckling under the pressure. The process resembles what happens to a sheet of paper when you push it horizontally against a wall. As you apply more pressure to its edge, the sheet starts to rise in the middle. In the real world, this bulge would be the Tibetan Plateau. A recent theory gives us the third explanation for the process. Their paper still has to undergo peer review, but the findings are intriguing. The international team of researchers introduced a new concept: the delamination of the Indian plate. This term simply means the separation of layers in a material that is supposed to be bonded together. Think of a sandwich that has cheese and ham slices between two buns. Take one of those layers out of the sandwich and you get delamination. In geological terms, this process involves the upper part of the plate peeling off and moving upwards. In the case of the Indian plate, this is the section that supports Tibet's elevation. The lower section is denser, which causes it to sink into the mantle. Plate tectonics are, in this way, similar to a layered cake. Chefs place the spongy, denser layer at the bottom, so the heavier top doesn't crush it. Scientists developed their thesis by analyzing helium gases in water samples from the region's hot springs. Helium-3 is a rare isotope that shows that the mantle is close to the surface of the Earth. Researchers measured helium isotope ratios at 200 Tibetan springs. The pattern they saw shows how close the mantle is to the northern Tibetan surface. Further to the south, they found plenty of helium-4, another isotope, which means that the plate is intact. It forms a barrier that helium-3 cannot penetrate, except in one region near Bhutan, in the eastern part of the Himalayas. The seismic activity in the region is good proof that delamination, the sandwich theory, is all real here. And it shows us that the mantle is intruding from the eastern side of the plateau. This concept puts under question the old, established ideas about tectonic plate behavior. The scientists behind the study suspect that the unique shape of the Indian plate contributes to the delamination process. It's the thickest at the northernmost point and the thinnest on the sides. If it's all true, it will mean that the continental collisions have a more dynamic and complex nature than geologists previously believed. Scientists still don't have enough hard evidence to prove the correctness of the new theory, just hints. Drilling to depths of over 60 miles is mechanically impossible right now. Such excavations are necessary to be 100% sure that the delamination process is going on. With the right technology, we would be able to better understand the hazards associated with earthquakes in the Asia-Pacific region. It's home to the famous Ring of Fire, where 75% of Earth's volcanoes are located. 9 out of 10 all earthquakes take place here. The India-Australia-Capricorn tectonic plate beneath the Indian Ocean is also important for solving Earth's tectonic mysteries. The term geophysicists use for such locations is nascent plate boundary. These are plates where tectonic plates are just starting to pull apart or push against each other. They represent the initial stage of a full-fledged plate boundary. Such a geological transformation unfolds at a pace of barely 5% of a single inch per year. That's about as long as a strand of spaghetti is wide. This shouldn't worry us too much from today's perspective. The India-Australia-Capricorn plate is destined to split in half over the course of tens of millions of years. Scientists from France studied records of 2 earthquakes that happened in 2012 and concluded there must be a nascent boundary there. Earthquakes normally occur at places where 2 or more tectonic plates meet. But the tremors in the Indian Ocean happened in the middle of the plate. The scientists used sonar scanning to map out the sea floor and see what was really going on there. After further examination of the marine area off the coast of Western Australia, researchers found a complex network of 62 pull-apart basins along a fracture zone. The scientific data backed up the idea that the tectonic plate was slowly but surely breaking apart. It's another proof that the outer layer of our planet is dynamic, not static. In some cases, you don't have to be a scientist to notice these powerful underground forces. Massive crevices emerged almost overnight due to heavy rainfall in a seismically active region in rural Kenya. First in 2018 and then again in 2023. The local population named the biggest of them the Grand Canyon. These events were not one-time incidents, but signals from the East African Rift System, part of the Great Rift Valley. This huge geological phenomenon stretching from Jordan to Mozambique shows us the gradual splitting of the African continent into 2 subcontinents. You can find rift valleys all around the world as proof of how tectonic plate movements are changing the planet. The East African Rift shows the underlying dynamics of the Nubian and Somali plates. The Nubian plate bears most of Africa, and the smaller Somali plate cradles the Horn of Africa. The 2 are gradually moving away from one another, which causes the formation of crevices within the Rift Valley. This process of continental rifting, going on at a rate slightly faster than the one in India, will eventually lead to the split of Africa into 2 continents. The whole process, which is about to happen in the next 10 to 50 million years, marks a significant geological event that reminds us of Earth's historical transformations. The last time our planet's geography changed so drastically was during the Jurassic period. The world map from the period looks recognizable, but the land masses were oddly positioned from the modern perspective. In the north, Eurasia was still loosely connected to North America, which was at the time called Laurasia. This landmass was slowly moving away from the supercontinent of Gondwana, further down south. It consisted of what we know today as Africa, South America, Australia, and Antarctica. At the time, the Indian plate was closer to Madagascar than to Eurasia, as it is today.
If there were cataclysms on Earth every 5 minutes, living conditions on our planet would be almost the same as 4.5 billion years ago. Back then, seas and oceans boiled, Lightning struck everywhere, tectonic plates changed their shape, lava flowed from volcanoes, and worse, no internet. The Earth resembled a vast boiling cauldron where life was gradually being created. If it starts to boil again, this cauldron could destroy almost all life on the planet. Consecutive cataclysms. Won't hurt to pretend. Let's imagine, shall we? Good morning! You wake up in a small underground bunker. The seismic sensor indicates that a 7-point earthquake will start in a few minutes. You pack a huge waterproof backpack and go upstairs. The underground bunker is protected from seismic activity. It moves with the ground, so you're safe here. But you need to leave the shelter because supplies are low. Also, yesterday, you picked up a radio signal telling all survivors to go south immediately. The coordinates they gave aren't far from your location. You have to hurry, though, before the landscape changes again. You open the hatch and find yourself in the middle of the desert. The sun is almost invisible beyond the gray sky. The ground is shaking, but you're not afraid. There are no houses or buildings, nothing to fall on you. You keep your balance perfectly, and the earthquake doesn't knock you off your feet. It's like jumping on a trampoline. The only danger is the deep chasms in the ground, but you can easily jump over them. After such an extreme morning warm-up, you decide to have breakfast. You take a tin can out of your backpack. You have a few minutes before the next disaster, so you eat and remember how your great-grandfather told you how all this started. Before all of this, the planet was divided into territories called countries. Millions of people lived in them, and then something terrible happened. The tectonic plates started to move, and the air temperature and atmospheric pressure began to rapidly change. In one day, earthquakes destroyed entire cities. Tsunamis and floods washed away the remaining ruins. Volcanic ash blocked the passage of sunlight. Forest fires destroyed almost all vegetation, and eruptions poisoned the air. Only a few people managed to adapt to such harsh conditions, and you are a lucky duck to be one of them. As you finish your breakfast, you're distracted by another ground tremor. Time to move on. Many people travel around the world alone, as they consider it a safer way of life. Some people form small communes, but no one ever stays in one place for too long. Your whole life is in motion, but you don't panic. One of the main rules during natural disasters is to remain calm, so all survivors have steel nerves and excellent physical training. You run a few miles south and suddenly smell something strange. You put on a gas mask. The earthquake has created a limnic eruption. Natural carbon dioxide is released from the ground to the surface. You feel comfortable in a gas mask, but can't run fast while wearing it. Far up ahead, you see a green forest, a rare place that was not affected by fires. You take off the gas mask and go to the tree to take shelter in the shade from the scorching sun. This green area is rich in vegetation. Colorful flowers, strawberries, and many other berries grow here. But you're concerned. Such fertile land comes from being near volcanoes. It spews underground magma rich in vitamins and minerals, so vegetation grows. You can see a high mountain in the distance. This is the volcano. An underground push occurs again and provokes an eruption. You gather strawberries and run away from this place as far as possible. Lava pours from the volcano's mouth and makes a fire in the forest. You unhook a folding scooter with a motor from your backpack and drive away from the fiery mountain as fast as you can. The sky is covered with volcanic ash, but this is not for long. A strong wind grows with each passing second. You realize a hurricane is moving in your direction. You take out a small shovel and dig a hole in the ground. The soil is dry, but you have enough strength to dig a small ravine in a couple of minutes. You dive into the shelter and cover yourself with a protective tent. The hurricane blows the volcanic ash in different directions, and the air becomes clear again. But the fire doesn't stop. The wind spreads through the forest. You get out of the ravine and put on the gas mask again. There's a lot of smoke around, and it's unbearably hot. You know the hurricane couldn't just appear without any reason. Hurricanes are formed when warm, moist air collides with the sea surface and rises to the sky, so there's water nearby. Great, because you're thirsty and want to cool down. A loud sound erupts behind you. You turn around. A massive wave of water approaches the fire. Without panic, you take your life jacket out of your backpack, remove your gas mask, and put on a diving mask and fins. The wave blows you off your feet, but you don't drown. Over the years of survival, you have learned to swim very well. You grab a passing tree and wait patiently for the flood to be replaced by another natural disaster. For 5 minutes, you sail under a black, stormy sky that sparkles with lightning. Despite the waves, you try to row south. It's getting pretty cold. You finally see the shore, but this is not a land, but ice. A strong wind brought a cold cyclone, which caused a fast temperature change. It's like you're in Antarctica. Snow and blizzards are all around. It's freezing, but you take out a thin space blanket made from foil and walk slowly south. Under your clothes, you put crumpled paper, bubble wrap, pieces of cotton. All this also helps to warm your body. Along the way, you collect several bottles of snow to melt later. Icicles form on your face, and you can't see because of the snowstorm. Suddenly, the snow begins to squish under your feet. The ice melts and turns into water. A hot stream of air blows into your face. You find yourself on hard, dry ground, looking up at the sky, then at your watch. 5 minutes pass, and the sky is again covered with black clouds. You take a metal plate out of your backpack and cover your head with it. A few seconds later, you are hit by heavy rain and hail. Giant balls of ice knock on the metal shield, but you go calmly and even with a smile on your face. The ground becomes wet and loose from icy rocks. When the hail ends, you pull out all the heat-insulating materials from under your clothes and hide them in your backpack. Then you lay out a few long spokes of steel. The spokes are wrapped with copper wire. You connect the spokes to each other, making one long antenna. You stick it in the ground and run away. After the hail from the rain clouds, lightning strikes the ground. More precisely, it hits the lightning rod you've just built. You wait for the storm to end, then take the lightning rod apart and return it to your backpack. An intense heat begins. You drink some melted snow and break your way through the desert. The earth trembles, and your adventure begins again. Earthquakes, carbon dioxide, fires, floods, snowfall, tsunamis, lightning, and again and again and again. With the help of a compass, you continue your journey and reach your goal a few months later. You see a long antenna sticking out of the ground. This is a place mark for entering an underground city. The city is built from dozens of massive bunkers connected to each other by tunnels. The city walls don't allow radiation to pass through, and they don't bend from daily earthquakes. People learn to extract energy from the ground. The Earth's core gives heat. This heat boils water, then steam is formed, and electricity is created at special stations. People get water from underground lakes and rivers. Instead of the sun, ultraviolet lamps are installed everywhere, which provide people and plants with necessary light. Natural disasters happen on Earth every 5 minutes, but humanity still has a lot of space underground. Rocks rolling down the slopes of a rumbling volcano, pushing other bigger rocks on their way, and eventually tumbling down into the ocean in a humongous cascade, causing a wave the height of which the world's never seen before. This is what might happen if the Helena slump of the Hawaiian Big Island falls off into the water. The Kilauea volcano is far from dormant. The latest eruption occurred in 2018. Its eruptions are usually accompanied by earthquakes of different magnitudes, and with each quake, the magma rocks on the slopes of the volcano shift down. These rock formations are called slumps, and the Helena slump is the most notorious of them all. In 1868, the shift of this slump caused a tidal wave rising as tall as 60 feet. But what's most troubling is that some 110,000 years ago, a landslide here led to one of the most powerful earthquakes ever, which in turn led to a mega tsunami of over 1,000 feet in height. Scientists are worried that such an event may repeat in the future. If that happens, the wave might engulf the whole of Hawaii and easily reach both North and South American coasts. Geologists are quick to reassure, though, that a landslide like this is unlikely to occur anytime soon. It's just too early for that. But when it finally does, the consequences will be catastrophic. Have a nice day! Yellowstone National Park in the western USA is world famous for its dazzling views, and especially the colorful Grand Prismatic Spring at its very heart. But we should all stay aware that Yellowstone is, first and foremost, an enormous caldera, basically a slumbering supervolcano. The difference between a regular volcano, like Kilauea from earlier, and a supervolcano is that the latter is thousands of times more powerful. Imagine an eruption spewing tons of huge rock and rivers of hot lava, pumping out clouds of ash that make countries stop air travel for weeks. And now multiply all of this by 1,000. This is what a Yellowstone eruption would look like. At first, a huge area in the middle of the national park would shake, crumble, and then blast upwards in a megaton explosion. Lava flows and magma rocks would cover the area of about 40 square miles, roughly half of Washington, D.C. But the greatest danger is the volcanic ash. The ashen plume would rise miles above and get carried by the wind in every direction. Since the eruption would be far from ordinary, the spread and damage would also be much greater than usual. The ash is thick and heavy, so it would cover a vast area in a blanket, destroying crops and even buildings. Worse still, it would spread in the air and block out the sun, leading to a drastic drop in temperature and an artificial winter. Even regular volcanoes can lower temperatures worldwide by a few degrees. A supervolcano may potentially cause a new ice age. Luckily, the chances of Yellowstone supervolcano erupting in the near future, or at all, are extremely low. There have been only 3 of those in the history of Earth, and there's no evidence such a disaster should repeat. Scientists estimate the probability at 0.00014%, which is lower than the chances of an asteroid wiping us all out. Speaking of which, if dinosaurs could talk, and were at least still alive for that matter, they'd tell you that asteroid threat is as real as it gets. Scientists at NASA say they've tracked 90% of all near-Earth asteroids of significant size, and none of them are a matter of any concern. But there are still the other 10% in the great unknown. What's more, asteroids can change their line of flight because of the pull of other celestial bodies and eventually turn our way. Lucky us. Now, if an asteroid big enough, like a mile across, hits the Earth, it will first cause an explosion powerful enough to erase a dozen big cities in a matter of seconds. Then the impact will raise a cloud of dust and debris that will block out the sun, just like the ash cloud from a volcano, and cause a centuries-long winter on the whole planet. But even if it falls into the ocean, which is more likely, a resulting wave will rise several miles high, washing coastal cities off the face of the planet. But at least there won't be a new ice age. Although scientists are pretty sure there's no such threat in the near future, it can't be ruled out completely, and humanity needs at least 5 years to prepare for this event. If a big near-Earth asteroid suddenly changes its course and turns right toward our planet, we won't stand a chance against it. Disaster movie, anyone? A much more probable calamity, though, rests right beneath our feet. It's the San Andreas Fault in California. The fault has been ready for rupture for years now, and scientists estimate that an earthquake along this line is likely to occur in the next 3 decades. And when it happens, it won't be nice. They expect a magnitude of 8.0, which is comparable to some of the most devastating quakes in history. It's all the more dangerous since California is home to some of the most populated cities in the western U.S., including Los Angeles and San Francisco. High-rise buildings are common there, and they're particularly vulnerable against underground shakes. The San Andreas earthquake might cause a whole lot of damage both to cities and countryside. In the worst-case scenario, the ground might break apart, destroying buildings, farms, and changing the landscape altogether. Still, scientists believe that the probability of such a quake is only 7% for the next 30 years. So there's a rather big chance, 93%, that we'll never see that in our lifetime. Yet, there's another earthquake hazard not so far away from the previous one: the megathrust in Chile. The country sits right above the subduction zone, an area where 2 tectonic plates meet and go one beneath the other. At the place of their meeting, stress has accumulated because of their continuous movement, and once that strain is too much, a major earthquake occurs. Chile has experienced a lot of quakes in the recent years, and scientists are worried those might be preparing the area for a really big one. They believe a great earthquake is due to happen before the end of the century, and it might be devastating to the coastal area. Even smaller quakes caused tsunamis that flooded the west coast, and a huge one like that is likely to raise a wave of incredible height. On the bright side, Chile now knows to prepare in advance for the coming natural disasters, and geologists are pretty sure people will be able to evacuate before the earthquake strikes. In September of 1859, astronomer Richard Carrington was looking at the sun and suddenly saw a bright flare on its surface. He made a note of it in his records, but only realized how important it was a couple of days later. The energy from that flare reached Earth and struck it directly, causing northern lights to appear above Cuba and burning telegraph lines all around the world. This was dubbed the Carrington event, and it was a solar storm. Such storms hit the Earth fairly often, but none of them were so powerful as the Carrington event, neither before nor after. But in 2012, astronomers registered a similar solar flare whose energy nearly hit our planet once again. If it had been just a week earlier, we'd have been in big trouble. Today, humanity relies on electricity in almost every aspect of life, and a powerful solar storm would mess with the electromagnetic field of Earth a lot. All electric appliances would either shut down or short-circuit, and huge transformers powering basically everything would go out of order for good. It would take years to repair them, and the cost of such a massive blackout would count in trillions of dollars. The worst of it is that science is almost unable to predict solar storms, and even if we could know about them in advance, we'd be powerless to stop them. The flare happens in a matter of seconds, and it takes about 8 minutes for the particles to reach the Earth's atmosphere, causing the disturbance. The power outage would come a bit later, in a day or so, when a massive cloud of plasma gets to our planet. At the moment, there's no protection against solar flares, and the chances of one powerful enough to cut all of our electricity in the next few years are quite high, about 12%. The only good thing about all this is that we now know of such a possibility and can at least prepare in advance. Hey, don't forget to pack some underwear and socks. You'll always need those.
This invisible line divides the world into two parts, and most animals, fish, and birds, for some reason, can't cross it. The line is called the Wallace Line, and it runs between Australia and Asia. It has its name after Alfred Russel Wallace, a British scientist and explorer who discovered it in 1859. He traveled to Asia to explore a group of islands called the Malay Archipelago. As Wallace walked through the jungles, climbed hills, and sailed on boats, he noticed something like an invisible wall. On its west side, in places like Borneo and Sumatra, he saw animals you might find in Asia. There were big rhinos munching on leaves and monkeys swinging from tree to tree. The forests were full of life, with all kinds of animals you'd expect to see in a jungle. But in places like Sulawesi and Lombok, just across the imaginary line he came up with, Wallace found animals more like the ones in Australia and colorful birds like cockatoos. The behaviors of animals differ on different sides of the Wallace Line. Some creatures are great at traveling across tough barriers like water, but others are not. For example, bats can fly across open water, but they sometimes cross the Wallace Line. On the other hand, big animals that live on land like elephants usually stay on just one side of the line. Some birds are shy and like to stay hidden in thick bushes and trees to avoid predators. They wouldn't feel safe flying over wide stretches of water with no place to hide. Plants don't stick to the Wallace Line as strictly as animals do, because they spread in their own unique ways, like with seeds carried by the wind, water, or animals. One plant genus, the eucalyptus, mostly stays on the Australian side, but one eucalyptus tree has made its way to the Philippines on the Asian side. Underwater, the Wallace Line doesn't matter as much. The area between the Wallace Line and Australia is called the Coral Triangle, and it's bursting with life. Now, after more than 150 years, scientists think they finally have an explanation of the Wallace Line mystery. They believe it all started about 35 million years ago, when Australia broke away from Antarctica and slowly moved up to crash into Asia. When this happened, the crash created a chain of islands called the Malay Archipelago between Asia and Australia. This caused extreme changes in the weather, which made the area very different and affected which animals could live there. Researchers used a computer model that looked at how more than 20,000 species of animals from both sides of the Wallace Line would have behaved millions of years ago. When Australia started to drift away from Antarctica, it opened up a huge new era of deep ocean around Antarctica. This is where the biggest ocean current on Earth, called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, began to flow. This swirling current made the planet's climate much cooler and completely changed how animals could live in different places. But not all animals were affected in the same way. Indonesia stayed warm and rainy, which was perfect for animals from Asia. These creatures could hop from island to island like stepping stones and make their way toward Australia. But animals from Australia had a harder time. Over millions of years, they had gotten used to living in cooler, drier places, so the tropical islands didn't suit them as well. Scientists believe if we can see how animals adapted to big changes in weather patterns millions of years ago, we might be able to predict how today's animals will cope with a similar situation. Other scientists after Wallace also tried to describe and explain the invisible natural border between Asia and Australia, and came up with their lines. The Weber Line, for example, is in a slightly different location than the Wallace Line, between the Oriental and the Australasian faunal regions within Wallacea. It's a group of mainly Indonesian islands that are separated by deep water straits from the Asian and Australian continental shelves. They were never connected to the big continents by land, so animals that could swim, fly, or float across the water made it to these islands. That's why the creatures living there are so unique and come from both Asia and Australia. Weber's Line is where the balance tips. If you go one way, most of the animals are from Asia. If you go the other way, most of the animals are from Australia. Another important migration event in the history of our planet happened in the Americas. Around 30 million years ago, South America became a separate landmass as tectonic plates moved and pulled it away from Antarctica and Africa. Once it was on its own, the animals living there started to evolve in unique ways and turned into creatures you couldn't find anywhere else in the world. There were animals we still see today, like opossums, giant rodents like capybaras and chinchillas, armadillos, anteaters, and sloths. Some of the animals from those times are now extinct. There were giant ground sloths, bigger than cars, roaming around. There were glyptodonts, which were like giant armadillos with super tough, bony shells. There were also huge, scary birds that couldn't fly but could chase down their prey. Up in North America, animals could still travel to other parts of the world through the Bering Strait. So North America was full of different animals like deer, bison, horses, camels, and even mammoths and mastodons. They all lived alongside predators like big cats, wolves, and bears. About 3 million years ago, the continents of North and South America got connected by a strip of land called the Isthmus of Panama. It formed because the tectonic plates shifted again. Some major volcanic activity between 25 million years ago also contributed to the process. Animals started to move between North and South America, and this long process went down in history as the Great American Interchange. During the Ice Age, huge glaciers in the north grew and shrank over tens of thousands of years. When the glaciers were at their biggest, they held so much water that the sea levels dropped, and forests probably turned into wide grassy plains. so animals had the perfect conditions to cross over. Giant ground sloths were among the animals that went up north from South America, all the way to Alaska. One special kind even roamed the chilly tundras alongside woolly mammoths and caribou. Lots of North American predators decided to explore the South. There were cats like cougars, jaguars, and saber-toothed tigers with their giant teeth. Wolves, foxes, otters, raccoons, and bears also joined the migration. The short-faced bear could stand up to 13 feet tall and weigh as much as a small car. South America also had some funny-looking animals called sanus, or South American native ungulates. These were hoofed mammals that evolved into all kinds of weird shapes, while South America was isolated. Big animals from North America, for example, relatives of elephants with strange tusks, came to the south and became some of the largest creatures around. The ancestors of today's llamas settled in the Andes Mountains, and deer, tapirs, and peccaries thrived in the forests. Animals kept moving back and forth between the continents for thousands of years. But as the Ice Age ended, many of the bigger animals, like the giant ground sloths, couldn't adapt and disappeared. It seems North American animals were better at adapting to their new homes. You can find armadillos, porcupines, and opossums from South America in North America. But many of South America's most famous animals, like jaguars, llamas, and spectacled bears, left North America long ago. Scientists think South America's animals, after being isolated for millions of years, had a harder time dealing with new challenges when their ecosystems changed.